Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Spanish or Barcelona GP. What was your thoughts of this race? Even though the Max Verstappen ran away with this race, I thought it was a fairly good race. I give it an 8 out of 10 or maybe a 7 out of 10 if I'm harsh due to Max just running away with it and not having any real considerations for that for front runner. Second on, I thought was a fairly good indication of things shifting around a little bit, and the passes in the midfield and back of the pack kind of kept this interesting for me. What was your thoughts? How did that turn out for you? Was you expecting more from this race, or was this what you kind of were looking for in this Barcelona GP? I will start off in the back of the field and work my way forward like normal, giving my thoughts on every driver as we go through this pack. So as we start off with Logan Sargent in 20th position, he started from the pit lane and actually gained a couple of positions on the start of the race, but couldn't handle it with that Williams and ended up falling back into the back of the pack where he stayed for most of this race. Valtteri actually started on 16th and ended up 19th. He lost a spot on the beginning of the race and could never really gain that back, and in fact was just struggling throughout this race and ended up in 19th, unlike his teammate who was actually doing fairly well in this race. Kevin Magnussen, I thought, did a decent job, even though he started 17th and ended up 18th. He was in the back of that field, and those Haas's were not anywhere close on maintaining that tire integrity, and they were just running through those tires fairly quickly. So I don't think it was necessarily his fault that he could not make up any more spots or in just losing one overall. Lando, even though he ended up 17th, I thought he had a decent race. He had an awesome qualifying in getting up to third with that crazy qualifying session. But due to that contact on that first lap with Lewis Hamilton busting that wing from Lando Norris, he had to pit early, which threw him into the back of the pack, and then they were not in that range, even from their talking about that car. They were not expecting to be anywhere in the front runners. They were hoping, trying to get into the points, but unfortunately for them, they dropped back out of the points. So that basically, due to that pit stop early on, just changing that front wing, shoved him to the very back, and then he could not really regain that many positions from that with that McLaren. Alex Albon actually qualified 18th and worked his way up to 16th. So he did a fairly good job in that Williams. He did make up 2 spots on the start and kind of had a standard race from there, working his way up a couple of spots. So a fairly good job from Albon. Nico Hülkenberg started off 7th with that pretty awesome qualifying for him, and then his tires just ran away from him early on, and then it was getting passed left and right. I had several people just passing him like in the single lap, dropping him back early on, looking for some kind of strategy or something else for that Haas that never did really pan out for him, dropping him back into that 15th position. Nick De Vries had a decent race, qualifying 14th and ended up 14th. He was up a little bit higher in parts of that race, part of the pit strategy and whatnot, but ended up in 14th. Not quite as good as his teammate Yuki, where he was, but I think he's making strides in that compliment for that AlphaTauri, trying to transition from that Formula E racing that he was in earlier. Oscar Piastri was in 9th, ended up in 13th. Again, those McLarens didn't seem to have the pace, and they kind of knew it from what their interviews stated after the race were, and just not having a very good race at all for them. Yuki qualified 15th and ended up in 12th, even after that 5-second penalty for running Juan Zhou wide in that corner in that pass, which I don't think it necessarily was his fault. I think he was alongside him completely. I think it was, Juan Zhou's should have known that, going from the outside, there was not really what he was expecting. There was plenty of space, and what I saw on that replay for that pass and that where attempted pass, I should say, from Juan Yuzhou around Yuki. Not really pushing him off in my regard, but what is your thoughts on that incident? Did Yuki actually deserve a 5-second penalty? In my view, he didn't, which would have pushed him up into the field, into those point ranges where I think more what he has deserved on this race for that Alpha Tauri for Yuki. Charles Leclerc qualified 19th due to some issues in that Ferrari in the qualifying session. Actually started from the pit lane and worked his way up to 11th. Not the greatest work through for the Ferraris is what we were hoping for. And I don't think what they were trying to expect was a little bit farther up in the grid, maybe into that front runner pack. But unfortunately for them, those tires in that Ferrari were not cooperating. He said, that first stint was horrible, and then he switched tires, and it kind of came to him for a little bit. But their strategy, again, I think was kind of weird, starting them off, on those hard tires, unlike most of the field, which were starting off on softs. And then pushing them really hard, trying to get through the field on those hard tires, and then not really having a save for them, and then having to switch to the softs and then back onto the hards later. And the same thing with Carlos Sainz. He started off in the softs and then switched to the mediums and then to the hard. And so his strategy was a little bit different, even though they pitted him quite early as well. So I think that was kind of odd on that circumstance. I don't know exactly what was going on with their pit strategy or their numbers for them. But that was the bottom 10 for Charles, and so just outside the points. And unfortunately for him, I think he needs all the points he can get at this point in time. Pierre Gasly qualified 10th and ended up 10th. He had those two hindering of the qualifying session spots for him that I'm not sure whose was at fault. I know there was some discussion that his team didn't really tell him in time for him to be aware of those people coming up from behind him. But in the end, the FIA gave him those 2 3-pace grid penalties for hindering in the qualifying session. So he, instead of being up in the front runners, he was down in 10th. He did a fairly good job in that Alpine, even being in that mid-pack, maintaining what he did. Then we have Juan Yuzhou, who's qualified in 13th and ended up in 9th, doing a really good job in that Alfa Romeo compared to his teammate, running up there and having fairly good time passing and getting past a little bit, but having some battles in that mix, but ended up in the points in 9th, which was welcome sight for that Alfa Romeo. Ocon qualified 6th and dropped down to 8th. Not too bad of a job. I don't think that Alpine really could, run with the front runners in this session. So they have a little bit of work to do. But overall, a fairly good job for him, gaining 1 spot on the start, and then just having a kind of a standard race, not quite where they needed to be on that speed, allowing some of the others to get through and past him. But overall, a decent race, I think, for Ocon, especially after that phenomenal race that he had last weekend. Fernando Alonso didn't have a very good race overall compared to what he is the rest of the year has shown, but a decent race for those Aston Martins. He qualified 8th and ended up in 7th, so he ended up gaining a spot overall, but generally didn't have the pace for those Mercedes or the Ferraris to some degree in this scenario. Kind of maintained his race, and in fact, at the very end, he was catching up to his teammate, but said, "Don't worry about it. I'm not here to pass you. I'm just here to gain that gap between me and Ocon, so that in case something happens like rain or something weird happens, he still has that gap for that flexibility of changing tires." So a very good maintaining race for Alonso, even though that Aston Martin we expect to be higher up in the grid than they are. And in fact, Lance Stroll, who actually qualified 5th ahead of Alonso for the first time, ended up in 6th, even dropping down a spot. It was good points for that Aston Martin having both of them in the points and decent points for them in this race. So a good race for Stroll, even though, like he said in his interview, they just weren't a match for those Mercedes and possibly the Ferraris as well, after being up in that top and just couldn't maintain that front runner spots. Carlos Sainz had a horrible race, qualifying second with a really good run, and then dropping down to fifth. I said, he pitted early on lap 16 for Carlos, and then from switching those softs to mediums, and there was some debate about that because he sounded like he was fine on those soft tires at the time, but they wanted him to run faster than he was on those sectors. So whether he could have run faster or if that was just the pace for that Ferrari, I'm not positive on at this point in time, but they couldn't maintain. I think in their views, they were saying that this was pretty much the pace and they got the most out of those Ferraris, which is a scary thought at this point in time, dropping back into the field. So they'll probably end up being behind the Mercedes and possibly the Aston Martins as well, with the fight with Alpine, in that Constructors' Championship. So who knows if Ferrari can pull it out with those changes that their team had. Can they get those developments in that, clicking of that team to actually be a competitor for that second position? Then we have Sergio Perez, who had pretty much a bad qualifying session, not making it to Q3. Ended up in the 11th spot for qualifying, but he worked his way up into the 4th, so a decent points for him, even though that gap is from his teammate is fairly far at this point in time. Still a good showing to try to work his way back into the field. Not quite as good as George Russell, who qualified 12th and ended up in 3rd. I think he did a phenomenal job in this race of actually pulling into the podium position, gaining that double podium for Mercedes for the first time this year, and letting them kind of celebrate those changes in that Mercedes. Hopefully that will stay for the rest of the year, giving a little bit more fight for those Red Bulls and Aston Martins, instead of them kind of running for them on their own. As I said, I think it was a phenomenal job for him compared to what his teammate did, which was qualifying 4th and ended up 2nd. Don't mistake me. I think Lewis did a great job in maintaining that with him actually, even with that contact with Norris at the very beginning, was able to maintain that position and keep into that top range and then work his way past Stroll and them up into that second position. And so Sainz, again, wasn't quite there. And so Lewis is able to pass him as well for that second position. So a great job for Lewis, but not quite as impressive overall if you look at where he started from. So my general thought was, even though he got the driver of the day, I think George probably deserved it more than Lewis. And of course, how can you not give Max the driver of the day, as he just kind of ran away with it, even starting off on those medium tires when all that pack right behind him was on softs, was able to maintain that start and maintain that first corner in the lead, even though there was a little bit tight cornering there, was able to keep that first position. And then once he had that first position, he was able to even gap on those medium tires from those softs into that first position and had a nice, easy time of it from then on. Even gaining the fastest lap after he's gotten that black and white flag near the end of the race saying, hey, you've kind of hit the track limits all the times you can. I know there was some back and forth over the radio, which I thought was hilarious, saying you don't need to go for fastest lap. You already have a black and white flag. He goes for fastest lap anyway, gets it, and then his team comes back and said, okay, can you just keep it between the lines from the rest of the race? You have the fastest lap now. You've done everything you can. So Max, pulling away from the rest of the pack as we've seen in the rest of this season. So overall, I mean, Verstappen did what he needed to do, an excellent job just maintaining that lead easily, and then the rest of the pack having to fight over that second and third position with his teammate of Sergio Perez coming back into the field for that fourth. So a decent race overall, some decent, battling throughout this race for that mid-pack. I mean, you saw some passes, for that second and third position, but it wasn't really a super big battle, except when you got back into the back or, the mid-pack or the end of that pack for those positions and the fight with Juan Yu and whatnot. So those were the really spot to watch for this race, I think. And that's what kind of brought this up to a 7 or 8 for me again. But so what did you think of the race? Up to you. If you want to comment and tell me what you think, that'd be great. It would help me out a lot. For driver standings, no changes, even though we had this kind of a crazy race in qualifying session. Max Verstappen running away with it with 170 points, with Sergio still in second spot at 117 and Alonso in third with 99. Lewis and George closing that gap a little bit to Fernando with those spots, but pretty much the rest of the race, the rest of the pack staying where they were. The other notable thing was Juan Yu basically tying his teammate with 4 points. So that's something to watch out for, to see if Juan Yu can actually pass his more experienced teammate in the battle for the standings throughout this season or not. This comes with the constructor standings. So we still see Red Bull, pulling away with 287 points now. Mercedes overtaking Aston Martin with 152 points, and then Aston Martin dropping back into that third position with 134. You see the point, gaining a point here and there from the rest of the field, but pretty much the rest of that pack is staying where they normally were. So you see that second, third position flipping at this point in time. So that basically concludes my reaction for this race. We have a couple of weeks and then we go to Canada, which I would love to see. That's a great race. So I'm expecting a lot of things from that race. What did you think of this race? Do you expect more fighting as we go through this season and getting more into the tracks that we normally see for a lot of the drivers that have a lot of experience? Do you think that'll play a factor? Until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.